Undercover CEO joins as trainee at his own company, stops cold when employee exposes hidden policy. Daniel Harper stood before his bedroom mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. Gone was his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, replaced by worn jeans and a faded blue work shirt from the local department store. His usually well-groomed hair was slightly disheveled, and 3 days of stubble shadowed his jaw. The Rolex watch that had been his 10th anniversary gift as CEO of Titan Logistics lay in his dresser drawer, replaced by a simple digital timepiece from the drugstore. "You look like a completely different person," his wife Sarah remarked from the doorway, a mix of amusement and concern in her voice. "Though I have to admit, the scruffy look suits you." Daniel adjusted his name tag. Danny Harris. The alias felt foreign, like a costume he wasn't sure he could wear convincingly. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Nobody can know who I really am." Sarah crossed the room and straightened his collar, a habit she'd developed over their 15 years of marriage. "Just be careful, Daniel. I know you want to understand what's happening in your warehouses, but what?" He caught her hand, sensing her unease. "But sometimes people don't want their secrets discovered. Even if your intentions are good." Daniel kissed her forehead. "I'll be fine. I'm just a regular guy looking for stable work after getting laid off from retail. Nothing suspicious about that." But as he drove his rental car, a dented Honda Civic instead of his usual Mercedes, toward Warehouse 37 on the outskirts of the city, Sarah's words echoed in his mind. The quarterly reports from this facility had been raising red flags for months: increased turnover, decreased productivity, and a surprising number of workplace complaints that somehow always got resolved before reaching corporate headquarters. The warehouse loomed before him, a vast concrete structure under the gray morning sky. Daniel parked in the employee lot, deliberately choosing a spot far from the entrance. As he walked toward the building, he observed his surroundings with new eyes. The security camera near the entrance had a loose wire hanging from it. The employee bulletin board was covered in faded, outdated notices. Small details that would never have been visible from a CEO's scheduled visit, but spoke volumes about the day-to-day reality. Inside, the orientation room buzzed with nervous energy as 5 other new hires waited for their training to begin. Daniel took a seat, noting how no one made eye contact or attempted conversation. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive even, despite the fluorescent lights and motivational posters plastering the walls. "Welcome to Titan Logistics!" The booming voice made everyone jump. Frank Gibson, the warehouse supervisor, strode in with an artificial smile plastered across his face. "You're all about to become part of America's fastest-growing logistics company. I'm Frank, and I'll be overseeing your training period." Daniel studied the man carefully. Frank's perfectly pressed uniform and polished badge screamed authority, but there was something calculated in his friendliness, like a predator wearing sheep's clothing. He distributed employee handbooks with practiced efficiency, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Now let's start with the basics. At Titan, we value hard work, dedication, and most importantly, loyalty." Frank's gaze swept the room, lingering just a fraction too long on each face. "Follow the rules, don't question the system, and you'll do just fine here." The morning crawled by in a blur of safety procedures and company policies. Daniel noticed how Frank emphasized certain points with almost threatening cheerfulness: the importance of keeping internal matters private, the strict hierarchy of command, the consequences of disrupting workplace harmony. During their first warehouse tour, Daniel's CEO instincts kicked into high gear. Workers moved with mechanical precision, heads down, shoulders tense. No one spoke unless spoken to. The few conversations he overheard were hushed, ending abruptly whenever Frank approached. "And here's where you'll start," Frank announced, gesturing to the loading dock. "Loading Team C needs extra hands. Miguel." He beckoned to a middle-aged Hispanic man organizing packages. "Show the newbies the ropes." Miguel Torres approached slowly, his weathered face impossible to read. "Yes, Mr. Gibson. These are your trainees. Make sure they understand our efficiency standards." Frank's tone carried an undercurrent of meaning that made Daniel's skin crawl. As Frank walked away, Daniel noticed how Miguel's posture changed subtly, less rigid, but somehow more defeated. The veteran worker began explaining the loading procedures, his voice quiet but clear. "First rule," Miguel said, glancing over his shoulder. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut. Second rule, don't expect anything to make sense right away. Third rule." He paused, making brief eye contact with each trainee. "Don't trust the promises they make you." The rest of the shift was grueling. Daniel's muscles screamed as he lifted boxes, his white-collar body unprepared for the physical demands. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological weight of what he was witnessing. Workers moved like automatons, fear flickering in their eyes whenever Frank appeared for his routine checks. During their brief lunch break, Daniel sat alone, observing. He watched how the veteran workers ate quickly, nervously, as if expecting to be called back any moment. He saw how the supervisors sat separately, speaking in low voices and occasionally casting suspicious glances around the break room. By the end of his first day, Daniel's disguise felt less like a costume and more like a window into a parallel universe, one existing right under his nose as CEO. As he drove home, his muscles aching and mind racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only scratched the surface of what was really happening at Warehouse 37. Sarah was waiting up when he arrived home, concern evident in her expression. "How was it?" Daniel sank into a kitchen chair, still in his work clothes. "Remember when I said I wanted to understand our ground-level operations better?" He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I think I'm about to understand more than I bargained for." "What do you mean?" "Something's very wrong there, Sarah. The workers are afraid, the supervisors are hiding something, and—" He trailed off, remembering Miguel's warning looks and Frank's artificial cheerfulness. "And I'm going to find out exactly what it is, no matter what it takes." As he showered that night, washing away the physical grime of warehouse work, Daniel couldn't wash away the unsettling feeling that he'd stepped into something far more sinister than inefficient management. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new observations, and hopefully, answers to the questions that now kept him awake, staring at the ceiling, long into the night. The next few days at Warehouse 37 fell into a grueling rhythm. Daniel's muscles had begun adjusting to the physical demands, but his mind remained troubled by the undercurrent of fear that seemed to permeate every corner of the facility. It wasn't until his second week, during a particularly exhausting evening shift, that he finally understood why. The warehouse intercom crackled to life just before closing. "Attention all workers on loading Team C." Frank's voice boomed through the speakers. "Due to increased shipping demands, we need volunteers for overtime shifts this weekend. Double pay rate for all extra hours." Daniel noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. Workers exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads slightly, others staring at the ground. Miguel, who had been teaching Daniel the finer points of inventory tracking, let out a barely audible sigh. "Something wrong?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. Miguel glanced around before responding. "Not here. Meet me at Joey's diner after shift. If you're smart, you'll want to hear this." 2 hours later, Daniel found himself in a worn vinyl booth at Joey's diner, a greasy spoon establishment far enough from the warehouse that no other workers frequented it. Miguel sat across from him, stirring his coffee absently, the overhead fluorescent lights highlighting the deep, worry lines in his face. 8 years, Miguel began, his voice heavy with resignation. 8 years I've worked for Titan Logistics. Started when my youngest was just a baby. Now she's in 3rd grade, and I can barely afford her school supplies. But the pay seemed decent when I signed on," Daniel said, maintaining his cover as Danny the naive newcomer. Miguel's laugh was bitter. "Oh, the base pay is fine. It's the overtime scam that slowly kills you." He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the empty diner. "Let me guess, you're thinking about volunteering for those weekend shifts, right? Dreaming about that double pay?" Daniel nodded, and Miguel's eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and anger. "Listen carefully, Danny. That overtime pay? It's a lie. A beautiful, cruel lie they've perfected over years." Miguel pulled out his phone, scrolling through his gallery before sliding it across the table. "Look at these." Daniel examined the photos, pictures of pay stubs, each showing regular hours worked for weekend shifts that should have been overtime. His stomach churned as he realized the implications. "They schedule us for extra shifts, promising overtime rates," Miguel continued, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. "We work the hours, 12, sometimes 16-hour days. But when payday comes..." He gestured at the photos. "Has anyone complained?" Daniel asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Miguel's expression darkened. "Remember Sarah Chin? She worked here for 5 years, tried to file a formal complaint about missing overtime pay. Within a week, they found a reason to fire her, claimed she was stealing supplies." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Or take James Martinez. He threatened to go to the labor board. Suddenly got demoted to night shift, hours cut so bad he had to quit." The waitress appeared with fresh coffee, and both men fell silent until she left. Daniel noticed how Miguel's hands shook slightly as he added sugar to his cup. "My wife keeps telling me to find another job," Miguel admitted. "But at my age, with my background, this is all I've got. And they know it. They know most of us are trapped here." "What about HR?" Daniel suggested, testing the waters. "Surely they..." "HR?" Miguel cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Lisa Marlowe in HR is part of the scheme. She's got this whole routine down. Oh, it must be a clerical error. We'll fix it right away." But the fix never comes. And if you push too hard... He drew a finger across his throat in a telling gesture. As Miguel spoke, Daniel felt a growing weight in his chest. He'd built Titan Logistics from the ground up, priding himself on creating a company that treated its workers fairly. Yet here, in one of his own warehouses, a systematic fraud was destroying people's lives. "Last Christmas," Miguel continued, his voice growing hoarse, "my daughter needed surgery. Nothing major, but the copay was steep. I counted on the overtime pay from holiday shifts to cover it. When the money didn't come through..." He stopped, composing himself. "Let's just say I still owe my sister-in-law for helping us out." Daniel watched as Miguel pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph of 3 children. "These are my kids, Danny. Everything I do, every extra shift I take, it's for them. The supervisors know this. They know everyone's stories, their struggles, their dreams. And they use it against us." The diner's neon sign flickered outside, casting alternating shadows across their booth. In that intermittent light, Daniel saw the full weight of 8 years of exploitation etched into Miguel's face. "Why are you telling me all this?" Daniel asked softly. "Because you seem different," Miguel replied, studying him carefully. "And because I saw you volunteering for those weekend shifts. I couldn't..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I couldn't watch another person fall into their trap without at least trying to warn them." As they prepared to leave, Miguel grabbed Daniel's arm. "Listen, Danny. Whatever you decide to do about this weekend, remember one thing: they're watching. They're always watching. The first time you question the missing overtime, they'll mark you. The second time, they'll test you. And the third time?" He shook his head. "Don't let there be a third time." Driving home that night, Daniel's mind raced with everything he'd learned. The calculated nature of the fraud, the psychological manipulation, the careful selection of victims who couldn't afford to fight back. It was more sophisticated and more sinister than anything he'd imagined. In his garage, before heading inside, Daniel sat in his rental car and made a quick voice memo on his burner phone. Day 8 at Warehouse 37. Systematic overtime fraud confirmed. Key players: Frank Gibson, Lisa Marlowe. Multiple victims. Need evidence. Need to move carefully. As he finally walked into his house, Sarah took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "Daniel? What happened?" He pulled her into a tight embrace, thinking of Miguel's children, of all the families affected by this fraud. "I found out what they're doing," he whispered. "And it's worse than we thought. Much worse." That night, As he lay awake planning his next move, Daniel remembered Miguel's warning about being watched. He would need to be careful, methodical, and above all, patient. The truth would come out, but one wrong move could destroy any chance of exposing the entire scheme. Tomorrow, he decided, he would volunteer for those weekend shifts. Sometimes, to catch a thief, you had to let them try to steal from you first. The weekend shifts proved to be exactly as Miguel had described. Daniel worked alongside his fellow employees for grueling 16-hour days, meticulously documenting every minute in a small notebook he kept hidden in his boot. The warehouse hummed with activity as workers pushed themselves to their limits, their faces bearing the desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd actually receive their promised overtime pay. But when the next payday arrived, Daniel stared at his pay stub with carefully manufactured shock. Despite working 32 extra hours at supposed double pay, his check reflected only standard wages. The discrepancy was glaring, but even more telling was how quickly Lisa from HR appeared at his workstation after he'd opened the envelope. "Is there a problem, Danny?" Her practiced smile didn't reach her eyes. "You seem concerned about something." "Actually, yes," Daniel replied, playing his role perfectly. "I think there might be a mistake with my overtime hours from last weekend." "Oh, that?" Lisa's response was immediate, rehearsed. "Don't worry, it's just a small system glitch. We'll have it corrected by next pay cycle." She patted his shoulder condescendingly. "Just keep working hard, and everything will sort itself out." That night, after his shift, Daniel didn't go home. Instead, he waited in his car until the parking lot emptied, then used his emergency override codes, ones that even Frank didn't know existed, to access the warehouse's back office. His heart pounded as he logged into the payroll system, knowing that one security camera glance in the wrong direction could blow his cover. The computer screen cast a pale blue glow across his face as he began digging through payroll records. What he found made his blood run cold. The discrepancies weren't just random errors. They were systematic, deliberate alterations. Every overtime hour worked was manually adjusted down to regular pay, but the original time stamps remained buried in the system's audit logs. Daniel began cross-referencing employee records, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The pattern emerged with horrifying clarity. Over 300 workers had been affected in the past year alone. The total amount of stolen wages was staggering, nearly $2 million. But where was the money going? The answer came as he dug deeper into the financial records. Every month, suspicious performance bonuses were being paid out to a select group of managers: Frank Gibson, Lisa Marlowe, and several other supervisors. The amounts corresponded almost exactly to the stolen overtime wages, filtered through a clever series of accounting tricks. "My God!" Daniel whispered to himself, downloading evidence onto an encrypted drive. "They've turned wage theft into a bonus system." A noise in the hallway made him freeze. Footsteps approached, then passed. Daniel released his breath slowly, his hands shaking as he continued his investigation. He discovered that before the payroll reports were sent to corporate, they were manually cleaned, all traces of the original overtime hours erased, replaced with falsified data that matched the reduced payments. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Workers were too afraid to complain forcefully, and those who did were quickly silenced. The paper trail was routinely altered, and the profits were distributed among the conspirators in a way that looked legitimate on the surface. As he delved deeper, Daniel found something even more disturbing: personal files on every employee, detailing their financial situations, family obligations, and vulnerabilities. Miguel's file contained notes about his children's medical needs. Others had information about mortgages, debts, and family situations that made them unlikely to risk their jobs by complaining. The sound of the cleaning crew's vacuum in the distance reminded Daniel that he needed to wrap up. But before he logged out, he noticed something that made his stomach turn: a folder labeled "Problem Employees." Inside were detailed plans for discrediting or forcing out workers who asked too many questions. Sarah Chen's supposed theft, James Martinez's demotion, it was all documented in cold, calculating detail. Daniel was about to close the folder when a new file caught his eye, one labeled Danny Harris, his alias. Opening it, he found notes from his first day. New hire shows concerning levels of curiosity. Intelligence possibly above average for position. Monitor closely for signs of dissent. Recommend accelerated testing protocol. They were watching him, just as Miguel had warned. But they had no idea who they were really watching. Back in his car, Daniel's hands shook as he called Sarah on his secure line. I need you to do something for me, he said quietly. Remember that external auditor we used for the Boston acquisition? Call them first thing tomorrow. Tell them we need a team ready to move within 48 hours. Daniel, what did you find? The concern in Sarah's voice was palpable. A cancer, he replied, starting his car. One that's been growing right under my nose. But before I can cut it out, I need to make sure we have everything documented legally and properly. The next day, Daniel arrived at work with 2 devices carefully hidden on his person, a small audio recorder and a backup drive containing copies of everything he'd discovered. He knew the next few days would be crucial. One wrong move, one slip in his act, and the whole investigation could be compromised. As he worked his shift, Daniel noticed Frank watching him more closely than usual. The supervisor's friendly smile seemed strained, his casual check-ins more frequent. They were testing him, just as the file had indicated. The question was, what would they do when he failed their test? The answer came sooner than he expected. As his shift ended, Lisa from HR approached him again. Danny, could you stop by my office tomorrow morning? Just a routine new hire check-in. Of course, Daniel replied, maintaining his facade of naive cooperation. Everything okay? Oh, absolutely. Lisa's smile was sharp as a knife. We just like to make sure all our new employees are adjusting well. Walking to his car, Daniel knew he was reaching a critical point. They were preparing to either intimidate him into silence or find a reason to terminate him. But he had something they didn't expect, the truth, documented and backed up, ready to expose their entire operation. That night, as he reviewed his evidence one final time, Daniel thought about Miguel and all the other workers who had suffered under this corrupt system. Tomorrow, he decided, he would spring their trap. But instead of becoming another victim, he would use their own scheme to expose them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Titan Logistics to its core. The only question was, who would strike first? The morning meeting with Lisa Marlowe felt like walking into a lion's den. Daniel had activated his hidden recording device before entering HR, knowing this conversation would likely be crucial evidence. Lisa's office was meticulously organized, awards and certificates decorating the walls, a perfect facade for the corruption that lurked beneath. Danny, Lisa began, shuffling through a file that Daniel recognized as his own from last night's discovery. How are you finding your time at Titan Logistics? It's been educational, Daniel replied carefully, watching her reaction. Yes, I imagine it has. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. I noticed you had some questions about your recent paycheck. Specifically about overtime compensation? Just wondering about the double pay we were promised for those weekend shifts, Daniel said, playing up an innocent confusion. I did the math, and the numbers don't seem to add up. Lisa's response was smooth, practiced. Oh, those pesky payment cycles. You know how these big systems can be. I'm sure it'll all be sorted out soon. When exactly? Daniel pressed, knowing he was deliberately failing their test. Because other workers say this happens a lot. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lisa's smile disappeared entirely. Miguel Torres has been sharing some interesting opinions, has he? I'm just trying to understand the process. Daniel continued, watching as Lisa made a subtle note in his file. When can I expect the correct payment? Tell me, Danny. Lisa leaned forward, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. Are you happy here at Titan Logistics? Of course, he replied. Good. Because happy employees don't ask too many questions. Happy employees trust the system, She paused meaningfully. Unhappy employees often find themselves seeking opportunities elsewhere. Usually quite suddenly. The threat was clear. Daniel left Lisa's office knowing he just painted a target on his back. By the end of his shift, Frank Gibson approached him with an obviously staged problem. "Danny, we've had some inventory discrepancies in your section," Frank announced loudly enough for nearby workers to hear. "We'll need to discuss this tomorrow morning." Miguel caught up with Daniel in the parking lot, his face etched with concern. "I heard what happened. They're moving fast with you." "What do you mean?" "The inventory accusation, it's their favorite setup. Tomorrow, they'll find evidence that you've been stealing. It's how they get rid of troublemakers." Miguel looked around nervously. "You need to quit, Danny. Right now. Walk away before they destroy you." Instead of leaving, Daniel spent the evening gathering his final pieces of evidence. He reached out to 10 workers who had been victims of the overtime scam, meeting them individually at different locations far from the warehouse. Each one was initially terrified to speak out, but Daniel's earnest approach and careful documentation gradually won their trust. Maria Rodriguez, a single mother of 3, broke down as she signed her testimony about lost overtime wages that had forced her to take out payday loans. Tom Chen, Sarah's brother, provided detailed records of his sister's wrongful termination. One by one, they added their stories to the growing mountain of evidence. The next morning, Daniel arrived early for his meeting with Frank, the recording device ready. Frank's office was small but imposed authority through its elevated position overlooking the warehouse floor. "Close the door," Frank commanded, all pretense of friendliness gone. "We need to discuss your future with Titan Logistics." "Is this about the overtime pay?" Daniel asked innocently. "This is about loyalty, Danny. About understanding your place in the hierarchy." Frank's voice dripped with condescension. "We've noticed you asking questions, spreading dissent among your coworkers." "I'm just trying to get paid what I'm owed," Daniel persisted, watching as Frank's face darkened. "What you're owed?" Frank laughed coldly. "Let me tell you what you're owed. Nothing. You're owed nothing. This company, this system, it works because people like you know their place. Corporate has no idea how we really keep things running down here, and that's exactly how it should stay." Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction as Frank continued to incriminate himself, everything captured on the hidden recorder. "So corporate doesn't know about the overtime situation?" "Corporate?" Frank sneered. "Those suits wouldn't last a day in this warehouse. They sit in their fancy offices, playing with spreadsheets, while we do the real work. The overtime system? That's our reward for keeping this place running. And if some workers have to contribute to that reward..." He shrugged dismissively. "That's theft," Daniel stated flatly. Frank's expression turned dangerous. "No, Danny. This is business. And unfortunately, I don't think you're a good fit for our business model." He pulled out a file. "These inventory reports show several discrepancies that trace back to you. Stolen merchandise, falsified records. All fabricated, of course," Daniel commented, watching Frank's surprise at his calm demeanor. "Doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is what we can prove. And by tomorrow, we'll have all the proof we need to terminate you. That is," Frank leaned forward, "unless you suddenly develop a better understanding of how things work here." "One last question," Daniel said, standing up. "Does the name Daniel Harper mean anything to you?" Frank waved dismissively. "The CEO? What about him? Just curious." Daniel headed for the door, then paused. "You might want to remember that name. I have a feeling it's going to come up a lot in the next few days." As Daniel left Frank's office, he could feel the news tightening around him. But this time, he wasn't the one in danger. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Auditors ready. Corporate inspection scheduled for tomorrow morning." The stage was set. In less than 24 hours, Frank Gibson and Lisa Marlowe would learn exactly who they'd been trying to intimidate. But first, Daniel had one more meeting, this time with Miguel, to ensure his friend would be protected in the chaos that was about to unfold. The pieces were in place. The evidence was secured. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed house of cards would come crashing down, and the true face of Titan Logistics CEO would be revealed to those who had abused his trust and stolen from his workers. The next morning, Warehouse 37 buzzed with nervous energy as workers whispered about the unexpected corporate inspection. A group of executives in pristine suits filed into the facility, their polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Frank Gibson and Lisa Marlowe scrambled to welcome them, their usual confidence replaced by deferential smiles. "Welcome to Warehouse 37, Frank announced, straightening his tie. "We're honored to have corporate leadership here today. I assure you, everything is running at peak efficiency." Daniel, still in his work clothes, stood quietly among the other workers, watching the performance unfold. He noticed Miguel giving him concerned glances. His friend had tried to convince him to stay home today, fearing retaliation for yesterday's confrontation. "Before we begin the inspection," one of the executives started, "we'd like to gather all warehouse staff in the main loading area. Direct orders from the CEO's office." Frank's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't part of the usual inspection protocol. Of course. Lisa, would you please make the announcement?" As workers gathered, Daniel could feel the tension mounting. Some looked worried, others curious. Frank and Lisa stood at the front, exchanging increasingly nervous glances as more corporate executives arrived. Then the warehouse doors opened one final time, and Sarah walked in, dressed in an immaculate business suit. Frank rushed forward to greet her, but stopped short when she walked past him without acknowledgement, taking her position among the other executives. "Thank you all for gathering here," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the now silent warehouse. "We're here today because some serious allegations have been brought to our attention. But before we proceed, I believe our CEO would like to address these issues personally." Frank's face went ashen. "The CEO? But I wasn't informed." "That was rather the point, Mr. Gibson," Daniel said clearly, stepping forward from the crowd of workers. He reached up and removed his fake glasses, straightening his posture to its full executive bearing. The transformation was immediate and striking. A collective gasp rippled through the warehouse. Frank stumbled backward, bumping into Lisa, who stood frozen in shock. "For those who haven't met me in person, I'm Daniel Harper, CEO of Titan Logistics." His voice carried authority that had been completely absent from Danny Harris's persona. "And for the past 3 weeks, I've been working alongside you as a trainee." The silence was deafening. Miguel's jaw had dropped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Gibson, Ms. Marlowe, please join me up front." Daniel's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. "And while you're here, perhaps you'd like to explain this." Sarah connected a laptop to the warehouse's presentation system. The screen lit up with payroll records, showing the systematic theft of overtime wages. Frank's face grew paler with each slide. That's not... Lisa started, but Daniel cut her off by playing the recording from their recent conversations. Their own voices filled the warehouse, admitting to the fraud, boasting about how corporate would never know. $2 million, Daniel announced, his voice tight with controlled anger. $2 million stolen from the people in this room. People with families, with children, with dreams and responsibilities. People who trusted us to treat them fairly. Frank suddenly found his voice. "You can't prove." "Actually, we can." Sarah stepped forward, gesturing to the executives. "Meet our external audit team. They've spent the last 24 hours verifying every detail. The altered payroll records, the fake performance bonuses, the fabricated documentation used to terminate whistleblowers. All of it. And let's not forget these," Daniel added, holding up a stack of papers. "Signed testimonies from 10 of your victims, including Sarah Chin, who you wrongfully terminated, and James Martinez, who you deliberately demoted into quitting." Workers began murmuring, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. Miguel stood tall, tears in his eyes, as the truth finally came to light. "You're suspended, effective immediately," Daniel announced. "Security will escort you to your offices to collect your personal belongings. The police have already been notified, and our legal team will be in touch regarding criminal charges." As security officers appeared to escort Frank and Lisa out, Daniel turned to address the workers directly, his voice softening with genuine emotion. "To every person in this room, I failed you. As CEO, the responsibility for everything that happens in this company ultimately rests with me. I didn't see what was happening right under my nose, and you suffered for it. For that, I am deeply sorry." He paused, making eye contact with the workers he'd come to know over the past weeks. "But starting today, things change. Every penny of stolen wages will be repaid, with interest. Every worker wrongfully terminated will be offered reinstatement with back pay. And most importantly, we're implementing new systems to ensure this can never happen again." The warehouse erupted in applause. Workers who had lived in fear for years finally felt the weight lifting from their shoulders. Miguel stepped forward, still looking somewhat shocked. "All this time, you were the CEO?" Daniel smiled warmly. "I was. And I meant every word when I said you were one of the most dedicated workers I've ever met. In fact," he glanced at Sarah, who nodded, "we're going to need new leadership here. People who understand both the work and the workers. People with integrity. Would you be interested in taking over as shift supervisor?" Miguel's eyes welled up with tears. Yes. Yes, I would." As the audit team began their detailed inspection of the facility, Daniel watched his workers, his people, gradually absorbing the morning's events. Some were crying, others laughing in relief. The atmosphere of fear that had permeated the warehouse was already beginning to lift. Sarah approached him, speaking softly. "That was quite a performance, Mr. Harris." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," he replied with a small smile. "Though I have to admit, I never want to go undercover again. 3 weeks of watching people suffer while maintaining my cover, it was harder than I ever imagined. But necessary," she reminded him, watching as workers began sharing their stories with the audit team. "Sometimes you have to become one of them to truly understand their struggles." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "And now we make it right. All of it." The warehouse that had once been a symbol of corruption and fear was transforming before their eyes into something new, a place of justice, transparency, and hope. The day's events would echo through Titan Logistics for years to come, a reminder that true leadership means protecting those who trust you with their livelihoods, their dreams, and their futures. In the weeks following the dramatic revelation at Warehouse 37, Titan Logistics underwent a profound transformation. Daniel Harper's office buzzed with activity as his team worked tirelessly to implement sweeping changes across the company. The priority was making things right with the workers who had suffered under the corrupt management. The company's legal team worked through weekends, processing back pay calculations and preparing settlement packages. Each affected employee received not only their stolen wages but also compensation for emotional distress and financial hardship. For many families, these payments meant freedom from the crushing debt they'd accumulated during years of wage theft. One morning, Daniel visited the warehouse again, this time openly as CEO, to witness Miguel Torres's first day as shift supervisor. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Gone was the suffocating fear that had once permeated the air. Workers moved with purpose rather than dread, and conversations flowed freely across the floor. "The new automated payroll system goes live today," Miguel reported, pride evident in his voice. "Every worker can now track their hours in real time through their phones. No more manual adjustments, no more clerical errors." Daniel watched as Miguel conducted his first team meeting. The veteran worker had transformed into a natural leader, his previous weariness replaced by quiet confidence. When he spoke about worker protections and fair compensation, his team listened with trust rather than skepticism. "My daughter asked me something interesting yesterday," Miguel shared with Daniel after the meeting. "She wanted to know why I'm smiling so much lately." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I told her it's because I finally work for a company that respects its people." The ripple effects of the warehouse investigation spread throughout Titan Logistics. Other facilities underwent thorough audits, though thankfully no similar schemes were uncovered. Still, Daniel took no chances. He established an anonymous whistleblower hotline that reported directly to an independent ethics board. Sarah Chin and James Martinez both returned to their positions, along with others who had been wrongfully terminated. Sarah took on additional responsibilities, helping to develop new worker protection policies. James became a trainer for the automated payroll system, ensuring every employee understood their rights and the tools available to protect them. The legal consequences for the corrupt managers were swift and severe. Frank Gibson and Lisa Marlowe faced criminal charges for wage theft and fraud. Their court appearance made national headlines, sending a clear message to corporate managers everywhere about the consequences of exploiting workers. But perhaps the most significant change came in the form of Titan Logistics' official statement to the press. Daniel insisted on complete transparency, breaking from the typical corporate practice of downplaying scandals. "We failed our workers," he declared during a press conference. "We allowed corruption to flourish in our midst, and hardworking families paid the price. While we've taken steps to make this right, we also want to share our story as a warning and a lesson to other companies. Your workers are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're people with families, dreams, and dignity that deserves respect." The statement went viral, earning both praise and skepticism from the business community. Some called it career-finishing to admit such failures publicly. Others hailed it as a new standard for corporate accountability. One evening, about a month after the investigation, Daniel received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Miguel's youngest daughter, the one who had needed surgery the previous Christmas. "My dad said you helped make things better," she said, presenting him with a hand-drawn card. Inside was a simple message. "Thank you for making my dad happy again." Daniel kept that card on his desk, a reminder of why the difficult decisions had been worth it. The company's stock had taken a hit after the public confession, but employee satisfaction scores soared. Productivity increased naturally as workers no longer feared exploitation. The final piece of justice came in the form of a trust fund established with the fines paid by the corrupt managers. The fund provided educational scholarships for workers' children, ensuring that the money stolen from families would ultimately help secure their futures. At the warehouse's first quarterly meeting under the new system, Daniel stood before his workers not as an undercover trainee or an austere CEO, but as someone who had shared their struggles and earned their trust. "Leadership isn't about power over others," he told them. "It's about power to help others. Every policy we make, every system we implement, should answer one question: does this protect and empower our people?" The warehouse erupted in applause, but it wasn't the nervous, obligatory clapping of the past. It was genuine appreciation from workers who finally felt valued and protected. Later that day, walking through the warehouse with Sarah, Daniel reflected on his journey from CEO to trainee and back again. "You know what the strangest part is?" he mused. "When I started this investigation, I thought I was looking for inefficiencies in our system. Instead, I found something much more valuable: the truth about what real leadership means." Sarah squeezed his hand. "And what's that?" "That true leadership isn't just about protecting profits, it's about protecting people. Without trust, without integrity, all the corporate policies in the world mean nothing." As they walked past the loading docks, they saw Miguel teaching a new hire the proper lifting techniques. The new employee wore the same nervous expression Daniel had worn on his first day, but there was something different now: hope in his eyes, confidence in his posture. The warehouse that had once been a symbol of corruption had transformed into a model of ethical business practices. Other companies began sending representatives to study Titan Logistics' new systems and policies. The story of the undercover CEO became a case study in business schools, teaching future leaders the importance of staying connected to their workers' reality. Daniel's final act in the aftermath was to institute a new company tradition. Every year, each executive would spend 1 week working alongside warehouse staff. Not as undercover agents, but as colleagues sharing the daily challenges and victories of the workers who formed the backbone of their success. As he drove home that evening, Daniel passed the old Joey's diner where Miguel had first warned him about the overtime scam. The neon sign still flickered, but now it reminded him not of darkness and secrets, but of the power of truth to light the way forward. The lesson was clear: corporate policies were only as good as the people enforcing them, and true leadership meant ensuring that power was never used to exploit, only to elevate. At Titan Logistics, that lesson would never be forgotten.